The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Safina Insecticide, and Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans.
Hey, Kara Oosteros here with RealAgriculture.com. I am back here today with another Soybean School episode, and I have here today with me Bryce Rampton, who is the seed agronomist for Syngenta based in Manitoba. How's it going today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
What part of Manitoba are you based in?
So I'm from Morden, Manitoba, so just a few miles away from the border. So just right in soybean corn country down here. So
absolutely. So we're here today to talk about planting dates and why they are so important, especially when we start talking climate and weather and stuff like that.
Yeah, and there's so many topics around weather. I think every farmer in Western Canada loves talking about weather, whether we always enjoy it or not. For us, we spend a lot of time looking at weather and different fundamentals behind, weather and climate, just to really understand what the fit is for soybeans in Western Canada, but also, different management aspects that we can incorporate into our operation to, maximize the yield potential within those environments. So, the past couple of years, we've been a little bit drier, and I think a lot of this conversation has drifted toward just rainfall in itself, right? And that's taken such a huge toll on the overall conversation around soybeans. And, when we look at rainfall amounts that we see, in a lot of cases, we're getting a lot better rainfall in the long run as far as climate is concerned than we have been seeing in this weather pattern that we've been in. So we still feel very comfortable that we have enough rainfall to really support a good level of yield within soybeans, especially in that black soil region in Western Canada. But there are some other aspects, even moving past rainfall, when we look at CHUs and overall season length and everything else combined, where we can probably do some things to say, well, it's not just about rain. There's a lot of other things that we can do. So the one thing, especially looking at this year and where we're at in southern Manitoba, I think it's generally been characterized as being a little bit cooler, a little bit wetter than usual, and there's not a lot of crop in the ground so far. And I think a lot of growers have made comments the past week or so kind of saying, by the time we get to soybeans, by the time we get all our cereals in the ground and we get to soybeans, it could be, middle of May, maybe looking at that 15th of May and something like that. So it could be getting a little bit later. So planting date is going to be very important this year. And it's probably one of the most heavily studied aspects of soybean crop production in any region, right? And pretty hot topic this spring as well. And I think when you look at all of those studies just in general, it paints a pretty good picture to say that generally there's a benefit to planting soybeans relatively earlier. And it hits a lot of different parameters of yield for soybeans in general. We see a higher overall number of plant nodes, better seed and pod initiation, maturity, effective seed fill rate are all affected by planting date. The question is just how early, and that's always a challenge in every given year because it's always different, right? We're always looking at different weather and climate kind of parameters. So it's all about managing those benefits with the risk of chilling, that risk of frost, the risk of stranding those plants below ground for a long period of time. And those dates will happen differently every year. So I think we get a lot of comments from growers when they look at that and they say, well, why are we messing around with this? Can't we just wait for the end of May, just forget about it? It'll come up fine and we'll be off to the races. Well, I say it is important, and it's important because of the timeline that we're on in Western Canada with soybeans. Everything is so compressed in our cool springs, it makes a lot of these really critical growing periods happen very quickly. So when we look at, pick a point, Brandon, Manitoba, for example, if we're growing soybeans there, most of the time our soybean relevant warm-up happens between that 10th to the 14th of May, sometime in that time frame. So if we planted right at the beginning of that warming period, well, by the time we get to the end of the month, we have just about enough CHUs in growing degree days to get those plants out of the ground. And that's really important because, well, what happens 3 weeks later, the days start to get shorter. And that's when soybeans start to flower. So if we look at that end of May to third week of June, well, we get about enough CHUs to get about 3 to 4 trifoliates on average, right? That's our climate. Which would put us in a pretty good spot to react pretty effectively to that photo period at that point in time and maybe get flowering by the end of the month. So if we would have delayed that 10 to 14 days to the end of the month, well, now suddenly we're in a position where we might be flowering into that, early to mid-July period, and we would have missed some of the most, consistent and best rainfall periods that we see. June and July typically are our best rainfall periods. So a week or two within that time frame can make a big difference. So when we look at this year, well, why is this relevant for this year? Like I said, we might be planting that May the 15th. So in a lot of cases, if we're done the cereals in the ground and we're looking at maybe we're growing cereal like a cereal like wheat, soybeans, and canola. Well, if we're done the wheat, what are we putting in next? Well, I think most growers in Western Canada would say, well, I'm going to put in my canola. It's what I've always done, right? And I think I'm trying to make the case to say, well, why not soybeans, right? When you think about that timeline and to maximize the benefit from that moisture in late June and early July, I think it really pays to get the soybeans in ahead of the canola. And I think the only things that's going to be sad is the flea beetles, right? With some of the challenges we've been having from early planted canola, I think it pays to maybe think about putting soybeans in first.
So is there any risk to putting the soybeans in too early? I mean, short of frost, what are some of the problems there?
Yeah, so I would say imbibitional chilling and just stranding that plant below ground. So the first 48 hours of soybeans' life are probably some of the most important. So they take up moisture very fast. And if that moisture is, especially when we get down to that 5-degree soil temperature, most of the time we say you want it to be at least 10 degrees Celsius. But I think in a lot of cases, if it's been 7 or 8 or 9, it hasn't been too bad. But especially when we get that 5 degrees and less, it really disrupts a lot of the enzyme activity within that developing seedling. We can see corkscrewing, all different slow emergence, stressed emergence from that. So we often say as long as those soil moistures are warm within that first 48 hours of that soybean's life, they usually can handle some stress after that. But chilling is a big one. Often we see it where we have a really nice day on like May the 1st. So we go and we plant the soybeans or something like that, and then the weather changes. And then it just sits in the ground for a really long period of time, and it's opening it up to infection from pathogens, insects, everything else that's in that soil. So that's the other thing. It's just looking at those long-term weather patterns to make sure that even if we do have a good imbibition period, it's not going to sit in the ground for 3 weeks and get infected or anything else, right? So those are the other two major risks beyond frost. It helps to be within, a week of your average frost date. So if most of the time, if you're in that 14th, 15th, usually that's within range. But yeah, definitely the other two are probably more common, if anything else.
Do you see a move of soybeans heading more west from Manitoba and the traditional soybean territory?
Yeah, and I think so. And I think we did see that shift a couple of years ago. So when we think back to after 2016, so 2016 was characterized by above average soil or rainfall for the year in most geographies of Western Canada. And then 17 and 18, in some cases 2019 was characterized by one of the worst droughts that we've seen in a long time, right? So I think a lot of people tried soybeans for the first time, in 17 and 18 and didn't have the success that they necessarily wanted. But I think when we look at the long run, we look at the fundamentals behind what they get in rain and everything else, I think it sets up really well. I think that we have a lot of good fundamentals behind, frost-free period, GDUs, overall rainfall and periodic rainfall. August rainfall is really important. I think all those factors line up really nice to be able to maintain and achieve a really good fundamental yield of soybeans. So, that's the difference between weather and climate. Sometimes weather can leave we can believe weather is climate, but I think that in the long run, we're going to be successful with soybeans in a lot of different regions. Okay,
awesome. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
One last thing I would say is if we do get into a period where we're towards the end of May and, we're planting in that, 25th to the 30th, I think that's when it really starts to think about your planting population. Like I was saying, we don't have as much time when we plant late to accumulate overall plant nodes and biomass early on in the season. So we need to compensate for that overall lower per plant nodes for just more plants in general. So often we like to recommend that if you do get late, think about increasing your plant population by 10% to compensate for that. So that would be the one last takeaway.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.